Hey everybody, can you hear me okay? Fantastic. Thank you so much for being here today. I want to welcome you to our mini symposium on co-producing knowledge at the Antarctic Science Policy Interface in a Complex World, where we really hope to facilitate open and provocative dialogues among scientists and policymakers that aim to explore how we, as a diverse Antarctic community, co-produce knowledge and really towards conservation outcomes in Antarctica. So I want to start by thanking my co-conveners, Natasha Gardner, who's in the audience taking notes. Natasha, will you stand up? We've all worked very hard to get this together. Anton van de Putte, who's running the Slido. And then Gilda Cacavo, who's here with me, co-convening. And then I also want to thank Susie Grant, who couldn't be here but did a lot of work to make this symposium happen. And my name is Cassandra Brooks, also one of the co-conveners. So I want to draw to your attention, we have a QR code on the screen for this Slido app. I encourage you to scan that code, and you can put in a question for the panelists, and there's also questions for you to vote on. So please, anytime throughout the session, feel free to add a question for the panelists. So I'll turn it over to Gilda to introduce our panelists.
So we have a great selection of panelists today to speak to you on these issues. So we have Maisa Rojas, we have Stephanie Langerock, we have Cesar Cardenas, Birgit Nystad, and last but not least, Lucia Ziegler. And they will introduce themselves in a little bit further.
So I'm going to go ahead and invite Mecha Santos, also one of our co-conveners, to share with you a bit more about the Antarctic Treaty System.
I was going to say good morning, but no. Hi, everyone. I'm so happy that you are here. And I'm going to make a little introduction about what is the Antarctic. Do you hear me properly? It's okay like this? Yes? Yeah. What is the Antarctic Treaty System? And I will have some little warning message. I will try to simplify the message for those that are already involved in these meetings. You don't need that detail, and I don't want to overwhelm that people that maybe wants to have a little better knowledge without feeling overwhelmed. So the Antarctic Treaty System is a set of environmental international agreements that regulates activities in Antarctica. And this, the first agreement, the most in the foundation of our system, then it is the Antarctic Treaty that applies to the area south of 60 degrees, and you can see on the slide is in blue. And it was, in this treaty, it was established that Antarctica was going to be dedicated to peace and scientific cooperation. Parties meet annually at the Antarctic Treaty consultative meetings in relation to this Antarctic Treaty. There are other agreements, legal agreements, that are important to take into account and take part of this system. One is the Protocol of Environmental Protection to the Antarctic Treaty that was signed in 1991 and designates Antarctica as a natural reserve devoted to peace and science. This agreement creates the Committee of Environmental Protection that meets alongside the ATCM meeting once every year. And then there is another agreement, which is the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, and it has the purpose of this arrangement is in relation to the conservation of Antarctic marine living resources, where conservation includes rational use, and that is why it regulates fishing in the Southern Ocean. Members meet annually and are advised by the scientific committee, which we call OSC CAMELAR, and its working groups. And from the beginning, science was the basis for agreement and then of the Antarctic Treaty, and has remained central to decision making. But how this works? How we go from research to decision making. If we focus on the Antarctic Treaty consultative meetings, we have, and that they meet along with the CEP, or Committee on Environmental Protections, In this meeting, national delegations and other organizations and stakeholders as SCAR, which is one of them, introduced papers. There are different kind of papers, working papers, information papers, and some others like background papers. They are sent tabled by the national delegations or the observers, and in these papers they provide recommendations to be addressed by the CEP. The CEP elaborates recommendations that then are treated in the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meetings, and if decisions are made by consensus, this turns into new conservation measures or regulations in the Antarctica. If we look on the other side, the Camelar Commission, it is a little different because we have working groups. So national delegations are able to participate in these different scientific working groups, and from that, there we introduce working papers, and these working papers, we have a report where we have recommendations that are going to be discussed in the scientific committee. At this point, SCAR, for instance, participates in these meetings as an observer, and they can also share, table some background papers. With all this information and discussions with the members, we elaborate recommendations that are going to be discussed at the higher level, which is the Cameral Commission, and if these recommendations are agreed, this turns into conservation measures. In the other way around, we also have sometimes these bodies, these policymakers decide that there is not enough information, or that we need some more clarity pathways for making decisions. So the Commission and the Commission requests the working groups or the scientists to provide a little more information to finally have a decision. And very importantly, as I mentioned earlier, these are consensus-based decision-making. It means that all countries or members need to agree when we are going to have a conservation measure or a resolution. And this is, sometimes there is some concerns because we understand that the process is a little slow because we need consensus. But there is, on the other side of this coin, when you have to agree by consensus, all the members have an equal voice in that decisions. How SCAR works? We have the SCAR Standing Committee on the Antarctic Treaty System, which is called SCATS, and this is a body that develops and provides independent evidence-based scientific advice to the Antarctic Treaty System. How they do that? They consult with SCAR experts and groups to compile information and formulate recommendations. This could be done in response to direct requests for advice from the ATS, as you can see these yellow arrows in the previous slide, or sometimes providing proactive advice, drawing attention to emerging issues. SCATS represents SCAR at CEP, ATCM, and Camelar meetings. And the provision of information includes different products or tools, which are working papers and information papers submitted to meetings, contributions to intersessional workshops and online discussion forums, and information summaries for policymakers published in the Antarctic Environmental Portal. Yes, something else I want to add. There is a difference with what is a publication and what is a working paper. As you as scientists are very used to publish papers, but the difference with a working paper is that should be short papers, probably between 3 and 5 pages, where you only highlight your most important findings. The rest of the information that you are used to have in a publication should be addressed as an annex. people that has the expertise to go through that in detail will do it. But for policymakers and for even scientific that has to read among 80 to 100 papers in a very short period of time, you need to learn how to communicate that information. And this is a process that takes time for all of us. As you start as a researcher, when you start doing science, this is the same. You start learning how to communicate your research to drive or to support the decisions that are being made in Antarctica. The key priorities or key topics for the CEP are environmental impact assessments from human activities, special protected and managed areas, especially protected species, pollution and environmental monitoring, tourist monitoring and management, codes of conduct for scientific activities, among others, like wildlife disease. And I'm pretty sure that many of you has information and has been are conducting research that are related with some of these key topics. Another one, if we are speaking about the camellar environment, the key topics and priorities are focused on stock assessment for harvested species, status of associated and dependent species like seabirds, marine mammals, and other fish species, marine protected areas, development of new krill fishery management strategies, incidental mortality by bycatch, and etc. So if you as a researcher ask yourself how we can get involved, well, this is part of the symposium today, but one way is through your publications that contain policy relevant findings, and as I say, we need to translate these publications into a paper that is digestible for policymakers. Through your national delegations, you can provide this national delegation will provide scientific advice to the CEP and CAMELAR, usually via your national programs. And you also can engage through SCAR through your science groups. Most of you participate in this science group. And this is also related to SCAT, which is, as I mentioned, the body that introduced these papers into these meetings. You can participate in the workshops and consultations. You can be author of groups for preparation at the papers submitted to the ATCM and CAMELAR. You could provide information or work information summaries that are part of our sharing through the Antarctic Environmental Portal. And you can be also part of some needs that has been identified, so like the SCAR krill expert group and the incoming SCAR fish. And also there is this is a big opportunity, and I would like to highlight that there is a program, a SCAR Anticon and SCAT Science Policy Fellowship Scheme that you can submit your research, and this is allowed you to participate in these meetings, which are very specific, and we will guide you and support you in your research for you to have the experience and probably to get involved through your national programs to be part of these meetings and, contribute to protect Antarctica. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Meita. So again, I invite you to use the Slido app to add questions, vote on questions. And what I'd like to do now is to turn it over to our panelists and take about 3 minutes, introduce yourself, share with us about your experiences at the Science Policy Interface, and any opening statements you'd like to make. So thank you so much.
Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Maisa Rojas, and I'm a climate scientist who happened at the moment to be Minister of Environment. So, given that this panel is about science policy interface, I thought I might very briefly share my path from being on a desk at a university running climate models to study past, present, and future of the climate, and including the geological past. I'm a paleoclimatologist, and becoming a minister of environment. I guess the main message here is that I decided to study physics when I finished school, and then I did a PhD in atmospheric physics, and that, and especially I guess for the younger people here in the audience, you can really decide whatever you want to do with your life. So don't let anyone take that away from you. You can decide to do theoretical physics, work with climate models, and then decide as well that all the knowledge that you have gained, you want it to be used at the top level of that earlier chart, right? To doing the science to actually, you can decide to advise, and then you can also decide to take the decisions at some moment. So, yeah, I guess that's my presentation for this evening.
Thank you. Good evening. I am Stefanie Langerock. I am head of the Department for Biodiversity and Governance at the Belgian Federal Public Service for Health, Food Chain Safety and Environment. And I am also, since 2015, the Belgian Commissioner for CAMLER and CEP representative for Belgium since 2020. So I have been in the Antarctic realm for almost 10 years now, and I also had the privilege to travel to Antarctica in 2019. As part of my initial remarks, I would like to say that for policy making and for policy makers, it is in fact important to see the whole. Many of you are doing part of science and very specific science, but for policy making it is important to see the whole. And so it is important for us also that the scientists show us the bigger picture of what we are talking about. It is also good to identify scientific gaps, and there's still a lot of unknowns in this world. At the same time, focusing too much on the gaps is also a trap that can be misused and abused by some people when we are getting into negotiations. So it is very important to focus on what we already know and to apply the precautionary principle. And that is what we as policymakers need to do. Gaps, or the absence of full knowledge, should not prevent us from making decisions. On the contrary, when we don't know enough, that should be enough reason to preserve, protect and conserve Antarctica in this case, until we are sure that whatever we want to do in Antarctica does not have major impact. Beyond that, I think policymakers do not always understand the data that all of you are presenting to us. And so we need a translation, and I think that is also what Meche already mentioned. We need more than just the facts and the numbers. We need the translation. We need to know what is behind the facts and the numbers. So we need to understand the data and also the potential consequences of what you are presenting to us. For example, what could be cumulative impacts? What is the impact up or downstream in the ecosystem of the research that you are presenting to us? And what is the impact to the whole stream? And something else I already want to mention at this stage, and probably many of you will not like it very much, but we also need to be touched. Emotion is important. if we as policymakers and as a society as a whole do not understand, do not sense, do not feel what you are talking about, what the impact is, and what the dangers are if we don't make decisions for conservation, then we don't take that into the negotiations. So often when we do negotiate, we are negotiating on dots and commas, and it's sometimes frustrating for many of the scientists in the room. But we need to know what we are negotiating about. We need to feel it, and we need to know that we are negotiating about real life. And science communication and education are essential for this. And the last remark I would like to make before I hand over to Cesar is, yesterday I was attending a session on rights for nature or rights for Antarctica. And I don't want to go into that discussion now, but what I do want to say is that we as an Antarctic community and you as scientists have an important role to give Antarctica a voice, because there's a lot of things you know that we in the world do not know. And we need to bring Antarctica closer to the hearts of all of us. Thank you.
Now I'll say what we as scientists need from you. No, just joking. Well, my name is Cesar Cárdenas. I'm a marine biologist, researcher of the Chilean Antarctic Institute, based in Punta Arenas. I'm also part of the Millennium Institute base. I used to be a happy scientist working on sponges back in the day, 2005, going diving and stuff like that for many years. And so I've been slowly moving to this kind of things that Stephanie just mentioned, how to translate the science, which is really important. And from this transition from being an benthic ecology, that slowly started moving to Camelar in 2016. Then I was lucky enough to see the adoption of the OSC MPA, although I left the night before, but still felt that I was part of it. And after a few years, after 3 years, I became the convener of one of the working groups. By the way, thanks to Mecha, who presented very well in a very short time how complicated things are in the way we do our work. And then since last year, I became the chair of the scientific committee. So, but yeah, it's really important, because I can say, like, I've been living this transition between working with sponges, and then I became like more into this part, and I normally try to give a lot of talks now, and also talk to students about how the importance of translating the stuff that we do, the simple or very complicated stuff that we can do and publish, into clear message for our colleagues, the policymakers. And it's really important. It's not easy. Sometimes it's really hard, but we really need to do it, and we really have to work hard on that. On communicate. For me, as like I even sometimes call myself a science diplomat or whatever it's called, because we are kind of like playing an important role trying to translate the stuff that a lot of you guys that are here do every day, every season, into something that can be clear and be kind of transformed into a conservation measure, if we're specifically talking about Camelar. So I think that's a really important work that we have to do. And I hear a lot of questions in other sessions about how scientists can like help achieving more protection or stuff like that. And I was really happy when I was invited to this. So I think this could be a really, really good opportunity to keep translating the science and bring it to the table of our colleagues and give good advice. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Birgit Njåstad. I'm the leader of the Antarctic program at the Norwegian Polar Institute, which is, in a sense, a place where we try to work to ensure that the science we do responds to the needs of the policy makers in the long, big picture. So, in my long career at the Polar Institute, I've always been sort of in the midst of the gray zone or gray shade area between science and policy, and this is an area of big importance and interest to me. I have also been the Norwegian representative to the Committee for Environmental Protection over a number of years. I was about to say decades, and I think I'm not wrong when I say that. And also just recently came out of a 4 or 5 year period as a chair of the Committee for Environmental Protection, which is then the advisory body to the Antarctic Treaty parties on matters relating to environmental protocol. So to me, as I noted, this place between science and policy is an extremely important and an interesting space to be in. And I think both Stephanie and Cesar has been kind of putting it out there why it's important and what we do. But I think also I want to highlight maybe in this starting point that bringing science to policy in the Antarctic context is not an easy way forward. There is no one size fit all solution on how we do this. Antarctica is complex. We're talking about a continent. We seem to forget that sometimes. It's a huge area we're talking about. It's a number of parties with different politics trying to govern this continent together. They use and think about the science and knowledge in different manners. They have politics that add on to the science. We have, of course, a number of nations with different capacities and resources to follow up and play into that space of the interaction. We have, of course, the geopolitics that play on top of everything. There's a cost and complexity in getting the science that needs to feed into the policy, and there is a large degree of uncertainty. And this is just to mention a lot of the issues. And I think, therefore, with all these complexities, which you add on and just make it even more complex, there really is no one way or one size fits all in the interaction sphere. And I think when we have these discussions, we need to have that in mind and not think that we find one solution, but rather go from issue to issue on how best to work our way forward. However we do it, communication and collaboration are key words. Communication between scientists and policymakers, collaboration between scientists and scientists, or scientists and policymakers, and also between nations and within nations. So this is a complex picture, and I think the Antarctic and the governance and the policy or science to policy discussion is very different, or maybe it's not, but the setting is very different than we see any other place. Makes it much more exciting, but also much more difficult. Yeah, I think I'll stop there now.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Lucia Ziegler from Universidad de la República. I'm an associate professor, and I'm probably the one with the least experience in Antarctica on this table. But I'm here because I was awarded last year's Anticon SCATS Fellowship on Science Policy interface. So that was the first generation for that fellowship. And it was a very interesting experience. My background is, I'm a scientist, I'm an ecologist by training. And I went through the unusual situation of having to prepare an IP and an information paper to submit to the CEP, actually before publishing results from, like scientific results from my studies in Antarctica. So that was quite an unusual situation. But it was a good and formative stance in my career. I think as scientists, we can approach Antarctica from different angles. So we can just do our science and expect that someone else brings this to the spotlight of policymakers and decision makers. But we also have the opportunity to engage in this system and take an active part. And I agree with Birgit that Antarctica is complex, and understanding the Antarctic scenario and its political and administrative underpinnings is not easy. I don't think it's easy for anyone, but particularly for scientists, probably is less easy. But I do not agree that much in that it's difficult for us scientists to translate our science to the Antarctic decision makers and policy makers, or at least in my experience, the Antarctic scenario is more prone to taking scientific outputs and incorporating them into and translating and transforming that into policies and decisions than some other scenarios in politics. So I had, for me, it was a good experience, and I would really recommend that if someone in the early career or mid-career here would be interested in applying for this fellowship, it's a very good opportunity to bring your research to the spotlight and to try to show to the people involved in taking and making decisions that what you're doing is meaningful, because ultimately what we want is to contribute to make a difference. So I think scientists, and even if it's a tiny contribution, it's a contribution, and we're moving forward. So that's.
Thank you for those introductions. We've been keeping an eye on the Slido questions that you've been submitting. And firstly, having just spoken about the Anticon SCATS Fellowship, we would like to provide a clarification based on one of your questions, which is anyone from any country in the world can apply to this fellowship. It does not need to be a member country of either the ATCM or CAMLAR. Indeed, because you will be going under the umbrella of SCAR, anyone is welcome. And this is in fact part of the benefit of this fellowship, as it brings in folks that may be from countries who might not normally have access to these spaces. So just to clarify that, anyone from any country can apply for this fellowship. Now, to come to our questions for our panelists. So we've been keeping an eye on some of the questions that you have been upvoting, and we might start with a question relating to perspectives from early career scientists. So it relates to the idea that early career researchers are often disconnected from policy, or perhaps even discouraged from getting into policy because it may compromise so-called research values. Our question to you is, how are policy and science values different, and how does this impact translation from science into policy? And you can pass the mics around yourself as you need.
Okay, I would say it should not be different. We know they are. I mean, I'm a full professor at the university, and I'm going to go back to my job when I finish this one. And so we perfectly know that in many cases a scientific career is narrowly evaluated through papers and grants, and the research impact in policy, many universities still don't have it. So I think it is our role in more senior positions that this should not be the case, that it should be valued as an integral part of that work. And speaking a bit broader than just Antarctica, think about climate change. The IPCC was created before the UN Convention on Climate Change. Then we have the Convention on Biodiversity, who also has a scientific panel, IPBES. So all our important environmental problems that we have a scientific counterpart, a panel that gives advice. And in all these spaces, early career scientists are very much welcome. And I would also encourage to participate in them, because they are an incredibly thorough, well, my experience is in IPCC, having participated in the fifth and the sixth assessment reports in different roles. There is an incredible scientific experience, but also in that science policy interface. So basically the question is, it should not be different, it should be encouraged, and you should try to do both of at the same time, because they are really maybe sometimes seen as a different side of the same coin, but we need thorough, robust scientists that do the science policy interface.
Thank you. I would like to add to that. Well, I first and foremost, I agree that in its core, the values should not be different. They should be the same. And when we are talking about early career scientists, I think it is very important, in fact, to hear also the younger and the newer voices. For those of us that have been around for a while, for example, when we are negotiating MPAs, marine protected areas, we have been on the negotiation and policy side in trenches for many, many, many years. And so having innovative views and younger views and innovative approaches, be it from very experienced scientists or from early career scientists that come with a new and blank view, that is very important to open our views and also open up negotiations and discussions. So even though the processes might feel very lengthy, slow, and are often a bit frustrating, I will say, don't get disencouraged by that. It is important to have all these different views, and that's also what I meant when I said that we need to see the whole, and that includes also new science, new views, and new people. So
I'll translate that to science now. No, I think it just came to my mind a good example of, based on what Stephanie just said about how to translate and for instance, the discovery of the fish nest some years ago. It's a really good example. There was like a Antarctic cruise, research cruise, like like studying the Weddell Sea, and they came into this like massive area full of fish nests, and yeah, of course that made up a really good publication in a high impact journal. But then the scientists like were able to communicate with other like more like diplomat or science diplomat people, and that was translated into clear messages for the policy people, although we haven't been able to agree on the protection of that area. It started a whole new area of discussions about how to protect fish habitats that at that time wasn't in the table. So that's a good example of how to your excellent paper that you did for your PhD that wasn't originally focused on an MPA, for instance, or about like fishery management, still can provide really good advice and can open a whole new area of discussions in Camera, for instance, or can be translated into a conservation measure in a few years. So that's really important. And also in terms of the early career like researchers, I think it's really important also. In Camera we have this Camera scheme that it's really good. We have really good examples of early career scientists that apply to this scholarship. They're able to come to the meetings, have mentors from other countries, and they can really like provide, of course, really good scientists, but they can bring like new energy. And we have really good examples of people that applied to that scholarship. Mecha was one of them some years ago. And she's the national representative of Argentina at the moment. So that's just one of example. There is many others here that are Camera scholarships. And some years ago, they didn't understand a thing in Camera because everything refers to a paragraph that belongs to another report. And you have to go like 10 reports back. And we all go like kind of crazy because we can't do this. But then they became really, really important scientists and providing high quality data, and that's really, really important.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to the Vice thoughts. I think this that you mentioned, Cesar, on the science that you do might be policy relevant without having in principle engaged in policy as such is an important part of engaging in policy. So I think there's a little bit of how we define this engaging in policy as well, which might be an important issue in this. And I agree, of course, completely that it shouldn't compromise the research or values and as such. I think also my small reflection here is that there is a more push now in the research community in general in the world, or in research in general, to move towards missions or societal needs and policy needs. So maybe this is an issue that is moving a little bit in the right direction in general as we move forward as well. That was just a point I wanted to make.
Thank you. We're going to move on to some individual questions for the panelists. And even though they're individually targeted, I welcome you to build on each other if you have more to say. So starting with Minister Rojas, the question is, how can one strategically figure out what the science needs are to inform policymaking?
It's an interesting question. I guess you have to follow the policy discussion to see where the needs are. And it's very important. I think Steph said it. You have to be very careful that it is, of course, as a scientist, you understand what the gaps are, what you would like to understand better. You know the nuances of that the answer might not be exactly all that you know, and hence it is important to fill those gaps. But you have to understand that the policymakers will take the evidence as one of the elements for the decision making at the end. As a policymaker, you have to put on the table many different interests and in issues that you have to take into account, and the evidence is just one of them. And if I get evidence that says, well, we don't really know the answer, there's so many gaps that we don't know, it is indeed not very helpful, right? It is better to phrase it in a way that indeed precautionary principle is a very important principle, right? And environmental discussions in general, so that you know where you have to advance, but that this lack of knowledge is not used as a excuse of not advancing and not taking not taking decisions. I will give one example of what Chile is doing, and I think it has helped a lot to have that more direct contact, which can help to be strategic. And it is that so for example, we have since 2022 a climate change law to address climate change, both mitigation and adaptation. And one of the principles of that law is scientific evidence. We will have to use the best science available to take decisions in this and that. And for that, there is a committee, there is a scientific committee that will have to look at all the strategies, all the plans that are elaborated by the state, by the government, to address climate change. So that's a direct influence where we can directly get that input for the best decision making. And the same is for biodiversity. It is just being implemented. In climate change, we have a bit of a longer path gone through there. And in fact, I was the first coordinator of that scientific committee when the law was still in discussion, which shows that I guess it made an impact, because I ended up implementing the law now as a minister. So if the at the country level, at the state level, at the government level, you can sort of the scientific evidence being in a transversal way be included in all these enormous complex challenges that we have beside understanding Antarctica, I think that is a way where this strategic input can be addressed correctly.
Thank you for that. We're going to switch gears to a question for Lucia now. In your introduction, you talked about aspects of what you've gained from being involved in the SCATS Anticon Fellowship. If you could build on that in the response here, and maybe mentioning something that surprised you about your experience in the fellowship.
Okay, so, well, I don't want to be repetitive, but something that actually surprised me was that on the table, where there were a lot of countries, representatives from those countries, there was a lot of science there, and those people were not scientists. They were there were science behind those speeches and decisions, and that was a surprise for me, because at least from where I come, it's not very often that you see scientists giving advice to decision makers and policy makers. So that's something that in Uruguay is like we are trying to build on that, but it's not something that often happens. And so that was quite a surprise, like how easy or like there was an actual pathway to do that.
Thank you. Next question is for Birgit. And we want to know, how do we turn policy needs into science? And when we thought about this question, we were thinking about your work in the CEP, potentially with the Climate Change Response Work Plan or 5-year strategic plan, thinking about how we know what the policy needs and we prioritize that as science opportunities.
So how do we move policy needs into science? Yes, that is a good question, and maybe the crux of the whole interaction between science and policy, of course, and thus again, I would say not a clear path, and it depends on the question. But when we have, so the CEP, of course, have, as you noticed, a lot of discussions with science as a basis for the discussions, but very often also, see if I can find my right track here, so many thoughts at the same time. Many times discussions lead to I'm going to have to stop there and start again. It's getting late. Yeah, how do we move policy into science or science into policy? This is, it's a bit of a sort of a fluffy question, you know? How do I, yeah, exactly. So what I wanted to say is that the CEP has a priority list of discussions to advise the ATCM, or the Antarctic Treaty Parties, on issues of primary concern. This is available, these priority issues are available through the CEP's 5-year work plan and also through its climate change response work program. Those strategic documents, if you can call them that, indicate what the needs are to be able to make policy decisions. Where are the gaps? Where is the knowledge gaps? The discussions in the meetings will say, well, you know, we know this much, but we don't know enough to say this. So what we need then is to ensure that that conversation from the CEP and those priorities from the CEP is somehow given back to the science community to act on in the next round. And I think for me, as I see it, and I have seen it, there is a lack of that, there's a lack of the translation of the science, not science need, the knowledge needs of the committee, and the uptake of the quest from the science side. And I wonder if we need to work to find not a translation aspect, but an arena where the policymakers and the scientists can discuss together why is this issue an issue for the policymakers, so that there's an understanding of what the policymakers are trying to do, so that science can be shaped to respond to that request and then be fed back through the system to then enable policy change. And that is more of a question of what is lacking rather than answering your question concretely. But that is what really is needed, is that the needs of the policymakers need to go to the science community. The science community need, or should, or hopefully would want to respond to that need and feed it back. But we need to make sure that that conversation in the middle is there, in the middle is there, so that what we get is actually relevant for the policy making. Sorry for confusing it a little bit, but it's a difficult, or not difficult, but complex issue.
No, thank you for that. And it's heartening to hear, because some of what you say is actually on the docket for Anticon to assist with. So we're excited to hear you repeat that here. Our next question will be actually for Cesar, and it's somewhat of the inverse of the question we had for Birgit, which is to say, what are some of the challenges that you perceive of getting science into policy decisions at CAMLAR, and what are some potential solutions in the future that you might envision for overcoming those challenges?
Challenges. What is that? I think there are quite a few. This might sound staged, but by the way, I wrote a little opinion about that in those magazines produced by our colleagues from INAJ that were left from the previous session. So I had more time to develop what I'm going to say now there. So if you're interested, grab a copy there. So there is a lot of challenges, and for me, well, of course, there is climate change that all in the room here that we know it's the main one, and it's something that we have to, or it really highlights the need for action. So that's probably the most pressing one. But as it has been mentioned here, uncertainty is also a big problem. Like, as Birgit also mentioned, we kind of forget that this is an entire continent. So even though we can believe that we have a lot of information from the Antarctic Peninsula, for instance, we still have a lot of gaps, and we still have to do a lot of monitoring and baseline information, and that could be used as an excuse to say, well, we can't take a decision because we don't really know what's going to happen, or we don't know what's going on. So in a way, we really need to be able as scientists to provide clear recommendations to the policymakers. And sometimes if we are not sure, we still have to come with something and say, well, these are the hypotheses. For instance, we have been trapped for many years in some discussions because we weren't able to come with a consensus idea. But nowadays we're able to provide options, and we still have to provide options to the policymakers so they can choose between the ones that they believe it's the best one. And going back to that opinion, I think this meeting, it's really good. Of course, CAMLAR has its scientific committee where we discuss a lot of the science that we need to develop, but sometimes we don't have all the expertise in the room. So a good example of this interaction is, for instance, SCEG, which is the SCAR krill expert group that has been around for 4 years, 5 years maybe. And it's a good example of how, us from the scientific committee can also come with clear questions or requests to the experts. In this case, this is an example of the krill experts. And for instance, they have been able to come with a krill hypothesis. And that it's helping us to improve the way we're working, so then we can work towards a new management strategy. Because going back to climate change, we thought we were doing really well in the Antarctic because there is a lot of krill. But since 2019, we realized that, the peninsula, for instance, is not the peninsula that we used to know 20 or 30 years ago. So we have to revisit the ways that we're taking decisions. So that's probably a good example how all members of countries can come together, of course, from the science, to come with clear recommendations and advice, and then that can be translated into policy.
Thank you, Cesar. So question now for Stephanie. It's a little bit long, so bear with me. To what extent should commissioners and policymakers understand scientific findings, and whose responsibility is it to ensure that the science is presented to the policy community at the right level? Then how can we use science for management decisions? So in other words, how do policymakers engage with scientists to co-produce knowledge?
Thank you for that. I think I think a lot of the answer I have already mentioned in my or I have touched on in my introductions. I think it's essential for policymakers to understand, at least at a high level, of what is going on. We do not need to understand every number and every piece of data, but we do need to understand the big picture, and that is also why the translation is so important. And for that, my questions for you would be, if you engage with policymakers, to think about, or my advice would be to think about, what do you want to communicate? What are the findings that you want to communicate? What do you want to achieve with your science? And based on your science and research, what action is needed? Because in fact, that is what we need to know. We need to have the facts, and we also need to know what actions we can take to mitigate any potential impact if we are talking about conservation and protection of Antarctica, of course. As for whose responsibility it is, I would say it's a joint responsibility, and I think it also feeds a bit back into the question that Birgit answered. It is a feedback loop, I would say. So it is important for scientists to engage with policymakers, but it is as important for us to engage with you and to engage with the scientific community, and then play ping pong together and work together and collaborate to move forward together. And so it is a joint responsibility to know what is needed, but also for us to support scientists to bring the research to the right level for decision making. And for me, as head of delegation or as CANLAR commissioner, my scientific representative is sitting there, and he's my person of trust. So when we are negotiating in the meetings, he is the person that I will turn to when I don't understand what arguments others are putting on the table. And so it is very important also not just to engage with the policymakers within the Antarctic Treaty System, but also with the scientific representatives, so that we can support each other mutually. I think, yeah, one more thing I wanted to say to reply to your question is the joint or the interaction is not only through the formal process. So Metje have had a beautiful explanation on how papers are being put forward up to the Commission or to the ATCM. And obviously, that is the formal process, and we need to follow that process. But the informal process of engaging with the policymakers and talking person to explain the science and to make us understand what is going on is as important. So don't be shy, just speak to us. We are all just human beings, and I would hope that we want to move forward together.
Thank you for that. That's a very positive note to end that point on. And I think, speaking of positive notes, we will come back to Slido if we have time. But before we do that, we wanted to make sure that we had some positive notes to round out this session with. And so this is a question now for all of the panelists. What constitutes success in Antarctic science policy space? What are some examples of success stories, and how did those come to be?
A long list. Yeah, well, I can start off. I'm going to be difficult and not highlight one big success story. But maybe before doing that, I will do that anyway, because I think the environmental protocol itself is a big success story in the policy science interaction and realm. It is a protocol that, of course, sets aside Antarctica as a natural reserve dedicated to peace and science and so on, but it also states very clearly that any decision and discussions, my words, that we base then decisions on to implement that protocol should draw on the best available science, which means that that interlinkage is there in the core of the instrument that we are that provides us with a mechanism to make policy decisions. And I think that's necessary to highlight. How that came about is a very difficult and complex story, so I'm not going to go into that. The other thing I wanted to highlight is that we have a tendency to focus on those times we fail, rather than actually seeing that every little decision or advice that goes into the treaty system is based on, at least that comes through the CEP, is based on some level of scientific advice and knowledge, and is a success in itself. So every little decision that is made is a science policy interaction. And I think that's a success, and which is then framed by the protocol. One could always list a few concrete examples, such as where a group of scientists worked hard on making the I always get the letters wrong here, but the Antarctic bioregionalization conservation, it's the other way around, I think, but anyway, the biological sort of compartmentalization around Antarctica, which now is the basis for sort of understanding the various regions of Antarctica, which again then makes its way into the discussions of protected areas and so on. Certainly the work that many scientists have done on non-native species work has moved its way into non-native species manual, which provides a framework for ensuring the right policies and actions relating to avoidance of non-native species. You could look at science which has informed the development of guidelines of use of remote piloting systems, RPAS, and so on and so on. So there's, and of course, I mean, I've heard the other day, yesterday probably, examples of new protected areas which have been adopted very recently at the CEP, where scientists have worked hard to provide the information to frame, for example, the new protected area in the Sørland on the mountain and Danger Island. All these are small successes that I think we need to just say make up the whole in our protection. And then we can, of course, continue to work on those bigger issues of the systematic approaches and so on and so on. But don't forget those small successes, which I think are important. And all this is really scientists who have understood the needs and then working with the policymakers and moving it into the system. Slowly. It is a slow process, so you always have to have patience, and I think that's what I meant with the complexity in the beginning, that it doesn't happen overnight, but it's a wonderful arena to work on. Sorry, that was long. Many successes.
From a Kamilar perspective, of course, the easy one would be the adoption of the Rossi region MPA. But then people would say, no, but that was 2016, right? 2015. Yeah, as Birgit mentioned, that's a huge achievement, and we have discussed how complex it is to achieve that actually. But we also have a small, a long list of like other achievements year by year, and the adoption of new conservation measures that protect different species and also help us managing in a precautionary manner some of the Antarctic marine living resources. Of course, we have, for instance, another thing that we can achieve every couple of years, or when there is new data coming, it's the protection of vulnerable marine habitats. That's also kind of one example of something that is really important, and that kind of information that might look like it's less important. It is really important. That's, for example, if you go and look at the map of the peninsula, it's full of VMEs areas that are closed for fishing. And because of so many, there is actually no bottom fishing there. And that's not as big as an MPA, but it's a good way of protecting, in this case, vulnerable marine ecosystems. We have the scientific observation program that has been for many years now. That's also a really good example of how we can do things right. And of course, like what I mentioned, the Kamilar scheme, that again, year in and year out, we get new scientists bringing excellent science, and yeah, they can come to the meetings and be really a great addition to our discussions.
As a kind of an outsider, I would say clearly the biggest success is that you have a treaty that declares this continent for peace and science. I mean, can't be a big success. We don't have that for any other continent or for the ocean in general or for the planet in general. So that's an enormous success that should be used, exploited, and hopefully spill over the rest to the rest of the areas where we have enormous environmental challenges that we need to address, and that we will have to address through science and through that advice that it can give to us policymakers. And I think I will give you two challenges actually from that success that would be great if this community can give to the world. And one is to get the 30 by 30 in Antarctica, 30% of marine areas protected by 2030. That would be an enormous success, and it has been difficult, but yeah, I think if we push all together, that is something that we really need to focus and prioritize. And the other important thing is tipping points. Everyone is really worried about the number of important tipping points that we might be approaching in climate change. And I once heard someone say that you could think about Antarctica as a big giant, that if you wake him up, there's no way back. And we don't really want to lose the West Antarctic ice sheet, right? And in that sense have really almost irreversible climate change. So I guess the challenge of understanding that tipping point better, and of communicating the threat and the impact of trespassing that tipping point is very important for climate change. And the challenge of having 30 by 30, that would be wonderful.
Well, I fully agree with everything that has already been said. I think the treaty as such is probably the biggest success, as also mentioned by Metje. And then the protocol for environmental protection, Rossi, MPA, those were huge successes, and we do not live them every day. But it is important also to see the smaller successes and the day-to-day or the year-by-year decisions we make. And so we have adopted several ASPAs in the past few years within the CEP and ATCM. We have agreed on a resolution on climate change within CAMLAR. Did we want it to be more ambitious? Yes, absolutely. But it is also part of the Antarctic Treaty System to work together and to work within the spirit of cooperation and collaboration and to find consensus with all partners around the table. And I think that is probably the biggest success that cannot always be translated in the room. No, that's not what I want to say. I think the biggest success for the Antarctic Treaty System as a whole is in fact that we work and we collaborate and cooperate and find consensus even when it's difficult, even when it is frustrating. And so step by step we move further towards conservation and hopefully 30 by 30. And that is what we need to keep doing. And every day is a success, or we need to acknowledge the small successes. And that can be someone that gets a scholarship within SCAR or within CAMLAR. That are also small successes that we need to celebrate. And I want to finish by saying that in the spirit of collaboration of the Antarctic Treaty System, together we can move mountains. And maybe, as we are talking about Antarctica, we should say, together we can keep icebergs from moving away and keep them where they are. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you all for closing on that positive note, and we just want to thank everyone for coming out tonight. I do want to highlight again that we have this fellowship through Anticon and SCATS for early career researchers. There's also a CAMLAR scholarship scheme that we've heard about tonight too, so great avenues for getting involved. And I want to emphasize a point that Stephanie made about the responsibility being both on the scientists and the policymakers, that we need to communicate to each other better, and for the policymakers to understand the science and for the scientists to better understand some of those policy needs. So yeah, just thank you all for being here. Check out those fellowships, and Gilda has a few thoughts too.
I want to echo everything that Cassandra said. I want to thank you also for all of the questions that you input into Slido. I'm sorry that we weren't able to get to really the majority of them, but I want to remind everyone, as Cassandra said, there are opportunities not only for scientists generally, but for early career researchers specifically to get more involved in these realms. But these fellowships, we're talking a handful per year. There's still ways for a larger number of you to get involved. As the panelists said, you can reach out to your national committee representative. You can ask them how to get their science in. If they don't respond to you, or if that seems too intimidating, come to SCAR. We have cookies, we have scats, we have Anticon. We have ways in which you can learn more about the policy space, learn how to interface, and perhaps a lot of the outstanding questions that we weren't able to address here could be addressed by interacting with these organizations. So we encourage you to keep these conversations going, reach out to us, become involved in our SCAR groups that work at this science policy interface. And thank you again to our amazing panelists.
Thanks, everybody. Lots of receptions to go to now, I think.
Sorry, before leaving, I have another activity, academic activity now. In the corner of the main square will be the launch of the Antarctic beer, Antarctic IPA. In the corner, 20-30 hours, La Birra Bar.